Okay, then. I think we are recording. Here, let me adjust stuff a little bit after I've already started here. Okay. I guess that's good enough. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 182. I am your host, Panyo Basa. This is my beverage. Unfortunately, those of you who are just listening to the podcast and not watching the video cannot enjoy the beautiful splendor of my beverage. And of course, 182 is not a prime number. It is in fact 2 times 7 times 13. And I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, hey, where is this bibinob? Or, if you prefer, where is that big red fish that was swimming around in the aquarium in the background every time that I saw that aquarium? Well, the thing is, Ishbibinab has passed away. He was the large male flame dwarf gourami, the last of his kind in my aquarium. All of the dwarf gouramis died out due to inbreeding and the dreaded dwarf gourami virus that now infects most dwarf gouramis that are bred in captivity. It is unfortunate, so I've had to switch over to pearl gouramis, which I don't like quite as much, but they're chill. And according to Grok, they have only an 8% chance of contracting the dwarf gourami virus. And even then, they probably won't die. So there is that. And we don't have a whole heck of a lot of questions this time around. You know, maybe in the low 20s. Which is fine. And so, I guess I should just start answering questions. And the first question is from PSA. And PSA has questions about the Nazi salute. He says, it's becoming more common for young people to throw the Nazi salute as a joke. They're just goofing around. There's no real anti-Semitic hate element to it. However, is there any bad karma being made in this action? I've been tempted to do it with my friends too, but I've held back due to possible karmic consequences. Also, Kanye West's song Heil Hitler, in quotes there, was played in a nightclub in Miami by a bunch of influencers recently, and it got a lot of backlash. Gee, I wonder why. At which point, is free speech acceptable and boys are allowed to goof around, and at which point is it extreme censorship? For example, American citizen Otto Warmbier was kidnapped and imprisoned by North Korea and sent back to the US in a coma for stealing a poster, which is another case of boys goofing around and the people in power overreacting. This reminded me of the boys in Miami goofing around and the people in power overreacting. So I guess we can sort of disentangle two questions from this, seems to me. One question is, it's kind of standard sort of question that I get asked. What is the karma of performing action X? And then the other one is, let's see, at which point is free speech acceptable and boys are allowed to goof around, and at which point is it extreme censorship? So let's just go with the first one. What is the ethics of doing the Roman or Nazi salute? Or if you thump the chest first before extending the arm, I'm pretty sure that's the Romulan salute from the old Star Trek. I don't think that the National Socialist German Workers' Party or the ancient Romans or it's also like the Olympic salute. I assume it's been decommissioned by now, but it used to be that just extending the arm, palm downwards, fingers forwards, was like the salute of the Olympics. But those pesky Germans just ruin that. Just like the name Adolf has been ruined, and a certain mustache has been ruined. Every once in a while, you'll see like a Saudi Arabian sheikh or something with the little toothbrush mustache. But, still Laurel and Hardy. It was Hardy who had that kind of mustache, but he was before World War II, I'm pretty sure. And I don't think anyone holds it against him. Well, like I was implying at the beginning, it's like, what is the karma or the ethical quality of extending one's arm in the Olympic or Roman or Nazi salute, or with the preliminary chest thump, the Romulan salute? What is the ethics of that? And as I keep saying over and over again, just a mere physical action is ethically neutral. There is no karma derived from a mere purely physical action. And so the karma or the ethics comes in through the motivation, the will, which is motivating the behavior. So if someone is just goofing around, they're just being silly, they're saluting each other like National Socialist German workers, for example, or just, there's nothing that an ordinary person can do that's just purely virtuous or purely unvirtuous. There's always going to be a shade of gray. Anything motivated by attraction, aversion, or semi-conscious stupidity, lobha, dosa, and moha, anything motivated by any of those is going to have some unskillful, unwholesome, akusala karma, kama in Pali, associated with it. But, there's different degrees. One person doing the salute because, they consider themselves to be genuine National Socialists who wish to extirpate the Hebrew race. They're doing that as just a matter of, showing their intentions to other people. Then they would probably get worse karma than someone who's like doing the Romulan salute from Star Trek, or someone at the Olympics. Although I would assume they don't really do that anymore at the Olympics. So it depends on the motivation. And you could say, well, it can offend people, and so you shouldn't do it. But even if you do something knowing that someone may be offended, or even someone probably will be offended, that's still not necessarily unskillful to do something knowing that it may cause offense, because to be offended is always the fault of the offended person. From the Buddhist point of view, from the point of view of Buddhist ethics, it is immoral to be offended. So somebody is just doing what they do for other reasons, and someone is offended, and they know somebody would probably be offended. That's not necessarily immoral. Just like walking from point A to point B, knowing that you're probably going to step on some bugs, killing animals, which is worse karma from a Buddhist point of view than offending somebody. Killing is one of the worst things you can do, to kill an animal. Or to kill a conscious being. But if you're just walking from point A to point B, that is your reason for going there. You're not going there for the purpose of stepping on bugs. And there have been times like in Burma. There was one time at the beginning of the rainy season out in the desert when the ground was just completely covered with these little gnat-like insects. And you just couldn't walk anywhere without killing them. Even if you were a Jain with the grass broom, these things were so tiny and so fragile, you'd be killing them anyway. But so long as your purpose is not to kill bugs, you can walk from point A to point B, and you're not committing any offense. You're not breaking a precept. You don't have to make confession, anything like that. And it's similar. Like if you got some valid reason or some even neutral reason for giving the Roman salute, you're not doing it deliberately to offend anybody, and you're not doing it deliberately to show off that you hate Hebrews, that kind of thing. Then if somebody does get offended, that's on them. So, it all comes down to if something is moral or immoral. It depends on the mental states associated with it. So if you're doing it maliciously, then that's going to be worse karma than if you're doing it just because you're silly, or you're like a Trekkie doing the Romulan salute, and then other people misinterpret that. Then, I mean, there's going to be this whole gradation. It's never going to be completely pure until you are completely pure. If you become a fully enlightened saint, then you can do as you please, assuming that even makes sense anymore. And you haven't done anything wrong, but so long as you're not enlightened yet, anything you do is going to have at least a little whiff of immorality to it. Even bowing to the Buddha. I mean, if you consider yourself to be, I am bowing to the Buddha, I mean, you still have like self-view while you're doing it. Well, that adds some bad karma, doesn't it? Or you do it out of greed for heaven or greed for enlightenment, that kind of thing. Then again, if there's any kind of attraction, aversion, semi-conscious stupidity, and until you're enlightened, there's always going to be some semi-conscious stupidity. There's going to be a certain amount of bad karma involved. But, I mean, it really depends on why you're doing it. What is your purpose? What is your motive for doing it? If you're doing it deliberately to make somebody offended, then that's on you. Whether they're offended or not is on them, but you trying to offend somebody is on you. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This also is from PSA. That first question was asked like 2 weeks ago. He asked the question after, under a previous Q&A after I'd already moved on to the next Q&A, or was in the process of recording the next Q&A. So it just got lost. And maybe some people would have preferred that it remain lost, but what the hell? So this next question is also from PSA. And he says, might the combustion adjacent architectural feature, position posterior to your sitting location, constitute a genuinely functional apparatus for controlled thermal generation, or merely a non-operational simulacrum intended for aesthetic signaling? And of course, he's referring to the fireplace that was behind me in the previous Q&A, that I consider it to be like a fake fireplace with fake fire because it's not real wood. You just flip a switch and it's like this natural gas fire, little flames coming out through like crevices in like ceramic fake logs. And I would prefer to have a real fireplace with real wood, but even so, even though it's a fake fire with fake wood that you just turn on with a light switch, still it does heat the living room. But the thing is, it heats the living room, but it cools down the whole rest of the house because the thermostat for the central heating of the house is also in the living room. So the living room warms up due to the fake fire in the fake fireplace, which then causes the central heating not to go on because the thermostat feels the warmth in the living room. All the other rooms get cold. But so long as we're hanging out in the living room, it doesn't matter. Might even save money that way. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, one of the most profound insights into human psychology that I have found since exploring Buddhism is that most suffering doesn't come from so-called negative thoughts and emotions, but from the resistance and non-acceptance of such thoughts and emotions. Without this resistance, the thoughts and emotions are simply blips of energy temporarily manifesting in the body as sensations. Is my understanding of this Buddhist insight into suffering accurate, or have I either misstated or oversimplified it? Yeah, I think it's a little bit inaccurate, because the negative thoughts still, I mean, those negative thoughts tend to be motivated by aversion. There's dosa in a negative thought. So there's going to be a certain amount of bad karma, let's say, a certain unwholesomeness or unskillfulness in having negative thoughts. Let's see. I'm not sure the negative thoughts and emotions. Yeah, like anger, for example, would be a negative emotion, let's say. Well, I mean, that anger itself is generating some bad karma. It's like you are wallowing in aversion, wallowing in dosa. So, yeah, I think that aspect of Romeo's like synopsis of how Buddhist ethics works, I think that is a little inaccurate. But I do think that most of, like in a developed country where we're not like, you know, this like hyenas are no longer a problem. And if you're living in a safe neighborhood, being attacked by human hyenas isn't much of a problem either. So most of the suffering that the average person living in a developed culture experience is just like artificial. It's like gratuitously generated. It's like you just think about how you don't have something, and then you have like aversion for this made up situation in your mind. An absence of something is not really an objective reality, but you sort of reified this absence of something into this thing that you have aversion for, and then that creates a certain amount of suffering. Or like a really simple case is like a toothache. So you got a toothache, and that's pain, and the pain isn't necessarily a negative emotion or a negative thought. That's like a painful feeling. It's a sensation. And it is true that pain is different from suffering. The toothache itself, just the throbbing pain in your tooth, is not the same as suffering. That's pain. It's the aversion for that pain, the desire for that pain to stop, insisting that pain not be there. That is what's really causing the suffering. So Romeo would be correct with regard to that. In that sense, he'd be right on the money, I think. But like Shakespeare said, it's like something like never was philosopher who could endure the toothache patiently. Something like that. Because a toothache, that's just hardwired right into the system. Something farther away, like a pain in your foot. Let's say you've got gout. Your big toe is sore. It's easier to maintain equanimity when the pain is way down there in your toe than when it's like right up here in your head. I'm not exactly sure what the mechanism for that is, but it does seem that pain, like a toothache, just the searing agony of a toothache, is much more difficult to endure with patience than other kinds of pain that are in other parts of the body. And I'm not exactly sure why nature designed teeth. Teeth really are not that great of an evolutionary invention. I think to some degree birds are better off just swallowing rocks and storing them in your crop, and storing them in their crop, I should say, and then using, just kind of tearing off hunks with their beak or whatever it is they're eating, and then it just gets chewed up by rocks in their crop, and they just swallow more rocks. It seems to work better for them in certain respects. They might have more difficulty eating certain foods, I suppose. But I'm just completely digressing. When the hell do we start talking about teeth and birds? So I have to read this. I've wandered so far away from the question, I should probably read it again, just kind of refresh my own memory of it here, my own short-term memory. See, one of the most profound insights into human psychology that I have found since exploring Buddhism is that most suffering doesn't come from so-called negative thoughts and emotions, but from the resistance and non-acceptance of such thoughts and emotions. Well, the resistance and non-acceptance are really the negative thoughts and emotions. You can have negative thoughts and emotions right off the bat, I suppose. But those are any kind of negative thoughts and emotions are going to be dosa. But even like a positive attraction is still creating suffering. Desire is the cause of all suffering, and just like wanting something is, it's a kind of dissatisfaction. So there's still suffering there. It's maybe more subtle, the suffering of desiring an orgasm for example, in the heat of passion is going to be more, it's going to be more mixed with pleasure and more acceptable, I suppose, than the agony of a toothache, or, you know, just fill in the blank with something miserable. I think there's a sutta that talks about how, like, attachment to pleasure, I mean, you're still bound. It's just like you're bound with a silken cord instead of with an iron chain. But you're still bound. It's still bondage in a non-sexual, usually, sort of way. So, I mean, the negative thoughts and emotions, usually in the West, are negative thoughts and emotions that are reactions to some not necessarily suffering-inducing situation. You know, I gotta clean the garage, and then you just think about having to clean the garage, and that makes you unhappy. So the idea that you have to clean the garage isn't necessarily a negative thought, but the aversion for having to clean the garage, or whatever the hell it is, that causes suffering. But still, I mean, you can have negative thoughts and emotions right off the bat, which already are they're creating suffering. They're making so-called bad karma, and then you just add like aversion for the aversion, that kind of thing, or whatever it is. So in that sense, I think Romeo is not entirely accurate in that you're generating suffering and bad karma right off the bat as soon as you start having negative thoughts and emotions, or even some positive ones, or at least attraction motivated ones. But with regard to humans in general, especially humans living in a relatively developed, peaceful civilization or society, then most of the suffering is just sort of like generated gratuitously. Even boredom, you know, nothing necessarily bad is happening to you, but still you're dissatisfied because you're bored. So, I mean, boredom is just kind of a weird kind of suffering that it doesn't even really have any cause other than a desire for something more interesting than this. So I hope I pretty much answered that question. But again, with regard to pain, pain itself may be a negative sensation. I mean, you want to call it a negative sensation, that's fine. But the pain and the suffering, the pain and any kind of karmic ramifications are different. Because the suffering comes from wanting the pain to stop, aversion for the pain. And it's just built in, it's just habitual. I mean, some people are better at resisting pain than others. You know, my father was a macho, tough guy. And, you know, one of his favorite sayings was, a little pain never hurt anybody. But even he probably wasn't cool with a really severe toothache. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's second question, which is there truly any suffering in this life beyond the resistance and lack of acceptance of so-called negative thoughts and emotions? Yeah, there's suffering in this life beyond that. I've already pretty much answered this question while answering the previous one, because this one is just kind of like not an axiom, a corollary to the first one. And like I've said, it's like even just longing for something it's not really a lack of acceptance of so-called negative thoughts and emotions. You know, you desire something strongly, you're unhappy, you're dissatisfied, and so you're suffering. But that suffering doesn't strike me as obviously being a case of lack of acceptance of negative thoughts and emotions. So attraction and aversion are both generating karma and dukkha, unease. But like I have been saying, in a world like most parts of America, especially if you're living in a safe neighborhood, you're not just living under a bridge or something, then most of the suffering is this sort of like mind generated. You know, just not being satisfied with the way things are. And that's pretty much what causes all suffering, really, not being satisfied with the way things are. If you can accept things, you're okay. Like one of my favorite mottos that I'm pretty sure I came up with, even though I'm sure other people came up with the same idea back in the Stone Age, is doesn't matter what it is, if you accept it, it's not a problem. And it doesn't matter what it is, if you won't accept it, it's a problem. Problems are not out there in some supposed empirical universe. Problems are a mental state. They are non-acceptance of the way things are. And you can do something about that. And that's something that's very important to learn if you're a student of Dhamma or Dharma, is that suffering ultimately is, it's like volitional, but it may not seem volitional just because your culture doesn't point it out to you. And it's just force of habit that causes, and just like animal instinct in the human animal, that cause people to act with aversion for certain things like physical pain, for example, or boredom. But when you look into your own mind through introspection, then you see that you really have a choice whether to accept or not accept the situation. And some situations are easier to accept than others, like the toothache. It's hard to accept that, I have to admit. But even in a case like the toothache, the principle remains true. It's just that the toothache is such an intense, such an advanced level challenge that possibly only a fully enlightened being could successfully, or at least a very highly advanced sage, could sit there with equanimity during a raging toothache. So, I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the saboteurs. And it says here that the saboteurs is only one person. So, there could be some multiple personalities or something, but we don't need to get into that. Maybe the saboteurs is sort of like a last name. Like people, like my own lay last name is Reynolds. And then there's a lot of last names that are really a first name with an S at the end, like Phillips or, let's see, Rogers, that kind of thing, which just means that there was like some distant ancestor who was some kind of big shot, and then everybody, all of his descendants were just sort of got the last name of Rogers' descendants. So maybe this person here, the saboteurs, is a descendant of an actual saboteur, and then he just got an S at the end and became his last name. Or could be some other reason. Who knows? I hope at least the saboteurs knows. But I haven't even started on the question yet. The question is, what is the difference between ego and self-esteem? You have to have some self-esteem and feel good about yourself, or you may start to feel low. Well, ego has more than one reason, or more than one definition, like in Freudian psychology. Let's look it up. I got a dictionary right here. Ego. Okay, noun, plural is egos. And then there's a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. So, I mean, you go with the first dictionary definition, and they're synonymous. Self-esteem and ego are the same. But if you want to get into psychoanalysis, like Freud, for example, it's the part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious and is responsible for reality testing and a sense of personal identity. Compare with id and superego. Or you want to get into philosophical metaphysics, it is a conscious thinking subject. So, yeah, I mean, it's like a sense of personal identity, like in Buddhist philosophy. See, I gotta rearrange windows here. In Buddhist philosophy, you may see that in English Buddhism, not in Pali Buddhism, but in English Buddhism, ego would just be sort of like the conceit I am. Ahankara would be one of the synonyms in Pali. So, I mean, what is the difference between ego and self-esteem? It would depend on what definition of ego you're going with. But like the first main definition in the dictionary is that ego is self-esteem, and therefore they're the same. But ego in the sense of like a more philosophical Buddhistic kind of term, or an English translation of a Buddhistic term, then it's just, the belief I am. Believing that you are some separate individuality distinct from the rest of the universe. So, let's see, the saboteur says, you have to have some self-esteem and feel good about yourself, or you may start to feel low. But, I mean, if you're practicing intensive Buddhism, then, like, you're practicing satipatthana, then you feel good about yourself, you're feeling good about yourself. You start to feel low, you note that you're starting to feel low, and you just observe that without judging it and without really throwing any kind of ego into it. So, yeah. But self-esteem, from the Buddhist point of view, it still would be a kind of unskillful mental state. Self-anything would be an unskillful mental state from the point of view of like classical Theravada Buddhism, or even pre-Theravada Buddhism. Maybe some later schools of Buddhism started thinking that self-esteem was just fine and dandy, but that would be kind of a deviation from the earlier teachings. So, you have to have some self-esteem and feel good about yourself. Well, I mean, just not to have desires, to have equanimity. I mean, at least you're not feeling bad about yourself. And that would be preferable to kind of just being smug. I've always kind of had a certain aversion, I guess, for smugness in other people. If anyone pointed out to me that I was being smug, it'd really kind of stop me in my tracks and have me like reviewing my behavior over the past many seconds just to see if what they said had any validity to it, because smugness in other people just kind of rubs me the wrong way. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. I apologize to the saboteurs if I did not answer it sufficiently, because I'm moving on to the next question. And Cleefy says, because it is in fact Cleefy who is asking the next question. Axing it. I am struggling to understand a notion of mind. If everything I perceive is a product of the unenlightened mind of mine, what created my mind? My karma? Well, I mean, that's kind of a tricky question. I mean, there's different ways you could look at it. I mean, really, anyone who wants to understand how I would answer questions really has to seriously consider the simile of the block of marble. I mean, I've talked about the simile of the block of marble well up into double digits at this point on these videos, and really just trying to understand what I'm saying would answer many questions that I get asked here from people that have heard the simile of the block of marble many times. Still, I mean, you should just consider that. Consider like the implications and the ramifications of the simile of the block of marble. And the simile of the block of marble, I mean, please forgive me for beating a dead baby at this point. I mean, you've got this block of marble. It doesn't have anything around it. So there's nothing to compare it with size-wise. So we might as well just say it is of arbitrary size. It is essentially sizeless. And within that block of marble are every single possible statue, including an infinite number of impossible ones. You know, like Myron's discus thrower with the head levitating above the trunk of the body. You know, I mean, it couldn't exist like that in real life. Oh, there's a fish freaking out in the tank over there. Damn. Excuse me. I got distracted by a large loach. So, I mean, even impossible statues can exist in this block of marble, but every single possible statue is in there, including statues that are so complex they become self-referential and start thinking that they are separate. They start having the conceit, I am. So before you get to that, I mean, the reality is just this formless, sizeless block of marble. And if you go with some early Buddhist philosophy, and especially like Hindu philosophy, you've got infinite formless consciousness that corresponds to that block of marble. So you've got infinite formless consciousness, luminous all around. And contained within that formless consciousness is every possibility, every possible mental state, every possible state of consciousness is contained within that infinity of mind, including some of these forms of mind have become so complex that they become self-referential and think that they are separate. And in Buddhist philosophy, the Buddha really doesn't try to tease out the origins of these things. He just, it's just like in some indeterminate past. It's like, I think it's very common in Buddhism where you just think it is without beginning. Samsara itself is without beginning, but like what caused my karmic momentum, the stream of volitional mental states that is my karmic stream. What is the origin of that? And the Buddha really didn't go there. He just says it's not known. It's just in the hazy. I mean, even if it had a beginning, the beginning would have been so hazy. You'd start off with, some very kind of primitive, like a crystal or something, or maybe just some sort of dream image in somebody else's mind that somehow persists after that person's dream ends. This sort of thing. You just start off with this shadowy semi-existence that then starts developing and like evolving. And the Buddha didn't really discuss how your karmic momentum starts. It could be like, I read in a book called Seth Speaks, 2 different theories on how a karmic stream of a certain being or a certain sort of lineage of beings through rebirth can be initiated. One is just through splitting. You've got some being with a lot of mental states going on, and it's just like part of that just splits off and starts its own existence. And I don't see why that would necessarily be impossible. But then the other weird idea that I got from this book, Seth Speaks, is the dream image one. Like, you dream about people in your dreams that you've never met before. They don't have any outward objective existence. You've just sort of generated this being, this shadowy, semi kind of being that may somehow continue to exist after you stop dreaming them. You just kind of, you gave birth to this shadowy semi being in this kind of ghost dream world that then somehow continues to exist. Or like even in the Upanishads, it talks about, just very primitive life. Or the Jains also talk about, like fire was considered to be a primitive form of life to the Jains. And just in ancient North India in the Buddhist time, it was a common belief that fire was a kind of living being. And it is kind of true. I mean, it needs food, it needs oxygen, it has a lot of the same properties as life. It doesn't have the same organization, and it's just like an uncontrolled oxidation reaction instead of like a controlled one that is then like fueling chemical processes and so forth, like happens in life. But I think I'm kind of deviating from Cleefy's question. But what created mind? I mean, the origins of it is, it is hard to say. It's unknown, and it may not be the same for all beings. Some may have split off. Some may have started as a crystal. Just the first tiny glimmerings of consciousness that is enough there that is able to perpetuate, like through rebirth or whatever. But what keeps it going is karma, definitely. That's the only thing you take with you after you die is your karma, which is like your psychic momentum. The motive force of your mental states that doesn't just stop at death, it has to continue. So, yeah, I mean, if you really contemplate the simile of the block of marble, I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around, which is one reason why people just don't wrap their head around it. But still, I mean, it does help to understand a lot of things. So it's pretty much my theory of everything. My TOE, if you will. And I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yoshibui. And Yoshibui, he's asking a kind of Majamaka question. I'll put the fez on just for the hell of it. I'll be right back. Here I am. Let's see, put this fez. Purchased from Fezorama. Well worth it, I might add. Not that I'm being sponsored by Fezorama. Okay, got to get the eye centered there. Okay, Yoshibui says, could you clarify what, quote, if the effect is different from the cause, unquote, means? If one punches another person in the left eye, then the bruised left eye would be the effect, and the cause would be the punching. So naturally, effect is different from what caused it, unless instead of a bruised eye, the person being punched gets a bruised nose, which is not possible. Or you could say the bruised eye is the effect of just an intermediary step. You know, first you've got the punch, which, you know, it hits the eye, and then the eye gets like swollen, some capillaries are ruptured, which then gradually causes the bruise to appear. But the bruise isn't there immediately after the punch. So you're not going to have a separation of time between the cause and the effect. Seems to me. So the punch is actually causing like the damage to the eye, which results in the bruise. But in a way, we're nitpicking here because, I mean, the whole question comes from one of the first questions. I think it is the first question in Nagarjuna's Mula Majamaka Karaka, where he's trying to debate the logical question. Is the effect the same as the cause? And if the effect is the same as the cause, then there would be no change, according to like ancient Indian attempts at formal logic. But according to Nagarjuna, if it's different from the cause, then it doesn't even need the cause, because there's like no real connection. So that's the argument he's making, that, I mean, if the effect is different from the cause, then, I mean, there's no qualitative connection between the two, so that the effect should be able to arise just spontaneously at random without even the cause being there, because there really isn't a connection. And, I mean, I could come up with arguments to debate that. It's like, you know, it changes form. The energy is the same. You've got conservation of energy, let's say. So, I mean, you could say the essence is the same. It's just the form changes. So you could say it's same essence, different form, that kind of thing. But like I said, I think it was the previous Q&A in which I was mentioning this, that first of all, formal logic was just getting a foothold in India around the time of the origins of Mahayana Buddhism. And it's like they're trying to use logic in a way that might not be acceptable to modern Westerners. But the point he's trying to make is valid. You know, it's like the whole purpose, or the main purpose of the Mula Majamaka Karaka, is to point out that you can't really answer any question completely validly. So you can shoot down any kind of question. or any kind of answer to any question. So it's like, with regard to every question that is asked or proposed in the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, I mean, first you say that the answer is not yes, the answer is not no, the answer is not yes and no, and the answer is not neither yes nor no. There is no valid answer to any question, which is what he uses to shoot down any attempts at understanding reality rationally. And that is a valid point. I mean, what he's trying to accomplish, I mean, he may be using kind of pre-modern, not entirely acceptable by modern standards arguments, but the main point he's getting at is a profound one, which is you can't understand reality by thinking about it. It's you're generating these unenlightened perceptions, these symbols that are supposed to represent things out there somewhere, but they can't. And I mean, the main proponent of this kind of thinking in the West, as far as I know, is Immanuel Kant. He did it a lot more logically by modern Western standards. So if the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka is unacceptable, its style of reasoning is unacceptable, try reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, for example, if you can, because it's very dense and very difficult to read. But the main point he was making is simply that yes is not a valid answer to any question, really. No is not a valid question or a valid answer. Yes and no is not valid, and neither yes nor no is not valid. And so it's just what Madhyamaka philosophy does is it shoots down all philosophies and then saves itself for last and then shoots itself down, just leaving emptiness. Because if you're going to understand reality, you're going to have to understand it through emptiness and not generating these perceptions, these symbolic perceptions that supposedly are describing ultimate reality when all they are is just samsara itself. Perception is samsara. And you're never going to understand nibbana or ultimate truth, the absolute, through samsaric means. It's just not going to work. And that's the main point. So, I mean, when I'm talking about the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, I think I made this fairly clear in the previous Q&A also. I'm not arguing that the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, everything it says is just, infallible. It was using Indian logic in the form that it existed in those days, back when formal logic, like Aristotelian thought was gradually filtering into India, like through trade routes with Rome or like Hellenistic states at that time. So, yeah, it's just, is the cause the same as the effect? And if it's yes, then there was really no change. And if it's no, then there's no connection. And so the effect should just be able to arise at random. I mean, that was the main argument that was being made. And you can accept it or reject it as you please. But he was using kind of questionable means to get to a valid conclusion. And that is that you're never going to understand reality by thinking about it. So Buddhist philosophy, I mean, the main purpose, the main benefit of Buddhist philosophy is just to attack all philosophy, turn on itself at the very end. And then it's philosophy, philosophizing. It can be skillful at, beginning stages, but you're never going to reach the goal through philosophizing. You're eventually going to have to let go of it. Now I'm going to take the fez off now. And I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from RFS. And this is kind of a simple, straightforward kind of question, which I do appreciate every once in a while. RFS says, while on alms round, are monks allowed to offer thanks or answer questions from the lay people? And so that's kind of two questions. There's the offering thanks question and the answering questions question. So I'm just going to separate that. Okay, so first question is, while on alms round, are monks allowed to offer thanks? And they shouldn't. In fact, um, in Burma and Thailand, it's just Buddhist tradition that monks do not thank lay people. I mean, they can, like certain ceremonies, like at the Katina festival or the Katina ceremony, they will offer what is called anumodana, or rejoicing over the good deeds of the lay people, which is an expression of like appreciation more than gratitude. It's acknowledging their good, their generous sentiments and so forth. But you can actually offend and anger a Burmese layperson or a Thai layperson by thanking them. If you're a monk, I mean, if they offer something to you, they're not doing it for thanks. They don't want to get paid by thanks in this life. They're trying to gather up treasures in heaven, to use a Christian metaphor. So, yeah, they're not doing it for thanks. They're not, I mean, they're doing it because they want merit. They want good karma. And so I have read in a book by Mahasi Sayadaw, which is probably like transcripts of his Dhamma talks, that's one thing monks just should not do. Do not thank lay people. I mean, in a way, you can sort of praise them for their generosity. You can express appreciation for their good deeds and their generosity and their good intentions and so forth. But thanking them for helping you, I mean, in a way, it kind of takes away some of the merit that they're earning, because in a way, you're already paying them. You're paying them back. They're getting their karmic reward through thanks, in a way. So it's just, even if it's technically not forbidden in accordance with Vinaya, I don't recall there being any rule of monastic discipline forbidding a monk from thanking a layperson. Still, in Thailand and Burma at least, it's considered to be bad etiquette. And lay people can be upset by a monk thanking them. Although in other times, like I had a Christian Burmese man who was acting as my attendant, and we went to get eyeglasses or something. I had to get new glasses. And this attendant, who was a sort of an upper crusty Burmese gentleman who was educated in a Christian school and converted to Christianity and so forth. And it's like most of the Burmese people that work at the American embassy are like half Burmese Christians for whatever reason. And he got on my case a few times, like, aren't you going to thank them? And it's like he didn't know Buddhist culture enough to know that monks really aren't supposed to thank people. But the people who sell eyeglasses in Burma, at least in Rangoon, tend to be like Hindus. It's Indians who pretty much run the spectacle salesman racket in Rangoon, or at least that's the way it was at the time. So maybe I should have, but it was just sort of ingrained in me as a monk. Monks aren't supposed to be thanking people. Which then gets a little trickier when the monk comes back to the West and people in the West don't know about Buddhist etiquette. They don't even know you're not supposed to point your feet at people, or feet at monks, or teachers, that kind of thing. So there is kind of a cultural aspect to this. And like I say, I don't think there is an actual rule of monastic discipline forbidding a monk from thanking lay people. It's just that in Burma and Thailand, at least, it's just, you're not supposed to do it. So I'll just move on to RFS's next question. While on alms round, are monks allowed to answer questions from the lay people? And if it's a simple question, are you going to be coming this way tomorrow, Venerable Sir? Then, of course, a monk is allowed to answer, simple questions like that. Will you be at the monastery later on today, Venerable Sir? I know somebody who would like to meet you. That kind of thing. Obviously, the monk can answer that question. He's not required to remain silent at all times, especially if people are asking him questions. Although, I mean, if they're asking for, some sort of guidance, or, they want you to give them a Dhamma talk or something like that, then it may not be the best time. You may say, well, you can ask me later at the monastery or something, but I'm not really free here, which is what the Buddha himself did in the Bahia Sutta, where you got the ascetic Bahia who goes to the Buddha. First, he walks from Western India. He hears about the Buddha. He's in Western India. The Buddha is like more Eastern, hundreds of miles away. Bahia, when he hears that there's this enlightened being called Gautama Buddha, he just packs up what little stuff he's got, takes what little he needs with him, and just starts walking, never spending the night, twice in the same place. Just he's got to meet the Buddha because he's heard of there's this enlightened being. So he goes to the monastery where the Buddha lives, and he's told the Buddha's walking for alms right now. So the Bahia just takes off. He's not even willing to wait for the Buddha to come back from alms round. He just goes after him, sees him walking for alms, and goes up and, teach me Dhamma. And twice the Buddha says, now is not the appropriate time. I'm walking for alms. But then Bahia just says, I don't know when I'm going to die. Please tell me now. And the third time, the Buddha gives him this brief, enigmatic, Zen-like Dhamma teaching. And then just minutes later, Bahia is trampled to death by a young cow. So, the Buddha was reluctant to give any kind of Dhamma talks while walking for alms. And really, monks should just mind their own business. They're not supposed to be looking up. You're supposed to be looking downwards. It's against the rules of monastic discipline for a monk to be looking upwards in public unless he's got a really good reason. So, yeah, you can answer brief questions, but you wouldn't want to be just standing there in the road delivering sermons while walking for alms. And so, I'm just going to move on to RFS's third question, which is, what leads to long-term benefit? And the first thing that came to mind when I saw this question is a verse from the Dhammapada, which is to do good, to refrain from doing evil, and to purify the mind. This is the teaching of the Buddhas. So, yeah, that would definitely lead to long-term benefit. Do good, refrain from doing evil, and purify your mind. So, what could have been like a vague, meandering kind of answer turned out to be kind of succinct, kind of pithy, if you will. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, are monks allowed to ask for specific kinds of food during sickness? For example, garlic or ginger tea for a sore throat, or vegetable soup if they have a cold, etc. Or are they just supposed to eat their one meal a day, accepting whatever is given to them, and tough it out if they get sick? Well, that is an option. They can just tough it out. If they're being like ascetic, they're just going to throw themselves on the mercy of their own karma, so to speak. They can do that. But it is allowed for a monk to ask for specific kinds of food during sickness. In fact, there's one of the Patimokkha rules says a monk is not allowed to ask for like certain high quality foods, including meat and fish, unless he is sick or the person he is asking has already given him permission in advance to ask for this kind of stuff. So a monk is sick, he can ask for medicine, he can ask for food that he think will help him to get better, even if it's like steak. Garlic on one hand, garlic and ginger, those are two medicines that a monk can store indefinitely. There's different kinds of food. I've probably forgotten. Let's see. I think I'd have to rack my brains. I don't want to sit here for 5 minutes just staring off into space trying to remember the terms. Sataha Kalika is one of them. But it's like 4 kinds of consumables. You got consumables that have to be consumed between dawn and midday, and that's regular food. Then you've got consumables that have to be consumed before dawn of the following day. So you can eat them or consume them in the evening, afternoon, evening, at night, so long as dawn hasn't happened yet. And that's mainly juices like fruit juice. And then you've got food that can be kept for no longer than a week, which are, Ajahn Tanisaro calls them tonics. It's kind of medicinal substances, or at least they were considered to be medicinal to some degree, which is, let's see, you've got butter, ghee, honey, molasses, and oil, like vegetable oil, like especially sesame oil, because that was the oil of choice in ancient North India. It's like every culture has its favorite oil. Like the Germanic tribes had butter, and I guess the Tibetans had butter. Like in the classical Greco-Roman world, it was olive oil. I'm not exactly sure what it would have been in China, but in India, it was sesame oil. In Burma nowadays, it's mostly peanut oil, although sesame oil is still used for certain delicacies. But I digress. And then finally, there's consumables that can be kept for life, which would include like pharmaceutical medicines, aspirin, garlic, ginger, turmeric, this kind of stuff. That it's even salt can be kept indefinitely, so long as you're not sprinkling it on your food to make it taste good. Because there is this rule that when you mix these 4 types together, it automatically becomes the type with the shortest expiration. So you're keeping sugar. You're allowed to keep sugar for a week, but then you sprinkle some of that into your coffee. Well, let's see. Let's use a different example. Make it simpler. You got salt that you're using for medicinal purposes, but then you got some food in your alms that day that you think really needs salt. So you take some of the salt and sprinkle it onto your food. All of a sudden, that salt is already past the expiration date because you've already had it for more than a day because you've been storing it. So it's kind of complicated. I mean, the rules of monastic discipline are much more complicated than most people think, including more than most monks think, because most monks really have not tried to really carefully investigate all the rules of monastic discipline. It's like 4 relatively thick books of rules. It's not just the Patimokkha rules. So, the answer to that question is yes. Monks are allowed to ask for specific kinds of food during sickness. I could have just said yes and moved on, and these videos would be a lot shorter. But what the hell? And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, this is kind of a tricky one. He says, can you explain in detail what you mean when you say women don't have a sense of honor in the same way that men do? I remember you mentioning that women in the past would derive their sense of honor from chastity. And that's true. It's like in the old days, a woman's honor was almost always her sexual purity, either her virginity or her faithfulness to her husband. That was a woman's honor. And so you had, there was like Lucretia, I think was her name, in just Roman mythology. She was back before the Republic days. This is back when Rome was ruled by Etruscan kings. And she was raped by, I can't remember if he was the Etruscan king of Rome at the time or if he was the son, like the prince of the king of Rome. But she was a married woman. And even though it was not her choice, I mean, he took her by force, still she self-deleted just because of the shame to her honor. And a lot of the Germanic women would do the same thing. I mean, they would delete their own children and then delete themselves rather than become the sex slaves of Roman soldiers, that kind of thing. So that was really mainly what a woman's honor consisted of in pre-modern times. And now that you've got like postmodern times, I mean, it's like honor itself is just faded into obscurity, just the idea of honor. I mean, you can talk about it with regard to military personnel or law enforcement officers, that kind of thing. But for the average person, I mean, its honor has just kind of just faded into a kind of superstitious word like sin. I mean, sin still is like a legit word for Christians, but just mainstream culture in the West, secular American culture, honor has gone the route of sin. But that's part of the reason for that is because Western culture has become feminized. So, I mean, honor for a man, he believes in something strongly enough, he's willing to die for his principles. It's living your life by principles is something that women don't do as much as men do. It seems to me, just based on my observations of men and women throughout the course of my life, and just reading history books and so forth, that women are much more flexible. They're much better at justifying anything they do, like telling a lie, for example, or just changing their mind. It's like they promise to do something and they say, well, it's different now. Whereas a man, if he's a man of his word, then he's very hesitant to break a promise, for example. Whereas women say, well, it's different now. The situation's different, so it's okay. They're much more inclined to just justify or rationalize anything they do and consider themselves to be completely right by doing it, which is kind of a leftist approach to things nowadays, partly because the left is more feminized than the right. It seems that's the way it is. Most women in America vote Democrat, most men vote Republican. But I think I might be straying a little bit from this somewhat volatile kind of question. But I do think men are much more likely to just insist upon standing on principle and not through fear of public opinion. I mean, that's more of a feminine thing. What will the neighbors think? That kind of thing. That's stereotypically feminine. It's just, I cannot look myself in the mirror if I violate this principle that I have held sacred throughout my life, and my father before me considered this to be a sacred principle. That is just more of a masculine thing. So, I hope I answered that question. Probably haven't offended very many women by answering that question because there aren't very many women who watch these videos. If I look I haven't looked in a while, but you look at the stats on my channel, and it's like 98% of my viewers are male. Go figure. I thought my dashing good looks would attract more women, but at least with regard to viewing my channel. And I was told by women in the past, oh, women are going to love your channel. But little did they know that my whole point of view is just sort of anathema to the feminine point of view. Anyways, I'm moving on to Xenothoid's next question, which is a follow-up of his first one. So we're not entirely off thin ice yet. He says, why would evolution cause the sexes to understand the concept of honor differently? Well, one reason for this is that just over the course of human existence, going way back into the Stone Age, one of the main causes of death was intertribal warfare. I have read that one of the main causes of death for Stone Age Europeans was intertribal warfare. And when you had intertribal warfare, what would often happen is the victorious tribe would just kill all the men and just enslave the women. You read the Old Testament, Moses was in charge of this kind of stuff. It's like, all right, all the women that have slept with a man, all the men get killed, all the boys, and then all the women that have slept with a man should be killed, but the virgin girls, you can keep as slaves. That kind of thing. That's right in the Old Testament. I think that would be in the book of Exodus. So, this has been going on for a long time. And so women have to be more flexible than men. Women, all of a sudden, they're prisoners of war. They're married to some conquering soldier now, bearing his children. all of a sudden she's got to speak a different language. She has to conform to different cultural norms, worshiping different gods. So women in that case have to be more flexible. Also, they're just not as physically strong or as aggressive as men. And so they have survived largely through submission. And so again, that would be conducive to sort of flexibility with regard to a lot of things, not being just rigidly adhering to principle, which would strengthen a man as like a fighter or like a worthy warrior of the tribe, a brave or whatever. But it's just, there was dimorphism, just physical dimorphism and psychological mental dimorphism in humans. Males and females are just, human nature is different between males and females, much more so than in other animals. I mean, other animals, some animals have way more sexual dimorphism than us. Anglerfish, for example, or like gorillas. I mean, the male might be like 2 or 3 times as massive as the female. And it's a real obvious difference there. But evolution would cause the sexes to understand the concept of honor differently, largely through what I have said, that just since the Stone Age, you've got intertribal warfare as just a major factor in evolution, guiding evolution and forming human nature, that, women had to be more flexible with regard to adjusting to changing cultures and so forth, because they might just get sold off to another tribe. There might be like a bride swapping or something, or they just get captured by another tribe, and all of a sudden they have to conform to a very different culture, speaking a different language, different taboos, different gods, and all this. So it just was more of a survival strategy, more conducive to perpetuating their genes, for them to be way more flexible with regard to like principles than men. Also, women tend to be more guided by emotion than men are. I mean, that's just a vague generalization. It's just like a matter of percentage points, gradations on a scale. It's not that women are completely irrational, men are completely rational. No, nobody is completely rational. But it was just since the Stone Age, probably since before Homo sapiens existed on this planet, that women or females, our female ancestors, just had to be more flexible with regard to principles and so forth than men, as just a means of surviving. And I'm going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is, how much of this do you think is biological versus culture? Well, it's definitely biological. I think it's just built into human nature at this point. So I think it's more biological than cultural, although it was cultural conditions, going back into the Stone Age, that eventually caused, human nature to, in a way, it was sort of evolving to, keep up with the culture, I guess. It happened over a very long period of time. So, I mean, there's a cultural element. And there's been a cultural element from the beginning, like the intertribal warfare stuff. There's cultural elements. And then there's the cultural elements of just the female prisoners of war, for example, or just young women that were swapped for other young women with a different tribe that have to conform to the new tribe, that kind of thing. I mean, there's cultural elements to that. But still, it does cause genuine biological adaptation to occur. Just like in Darwinian sexual selection, it causes, just sort of sexual preferences. It's like some species of bird, the females, through whatever reason, just have a preference of red over blue. A male has more red and less blue, she's more likely to pick him. Whereas in a different species, it might be blue over red, and it's just like this arbitrary, maybe some weird mutation that occurs that causes the females of one species to like blue better than red, and the other species likes red better than blue. But I think it is largely biological at this point, although the culture is kind of suited to humanity, and it does kind of fit just human nature to a large degree. I mean, cultural norms that don't really jive with human nature, I mean, it's going to cause instability in the culture, and it's going to have less survival value. Although, like I said, there's the cultural thing now of honor just sort of going out of fashion because the culture has been so feminized. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita, after my female viewership has gone from 2% to 1%, Siddhartha Lohachita says, do you think modern psychology or psychiatry is a joke? And to some degree, I mean, in a way, psychology has been a pseudoscience for most of its existence. I mean, there's even pseudoscience, let's say alchemy or astrology. Those are kind of two of the classic examples of pseudoscience that really existed pretty much in the mainstream for centuries. And the alchemists, I mean, that was proto-chemistry. I mean, there was some genuine chemistry. You know, the alchemists knew how to make sulfuric acid, for example, oil of vitriol, I think it was called. You know, they knew how to like refine like elemental mercury out of ores, this kind of stuff, or like medicine, pre-modern medicine, like Galen, this kind of stuff. I mean, they weren't really scientific, but still a lot of it was based on just knowing what works, seeing patterns. You know, I give them this kind of leaf to chew on and it relieves pain. And so, I mean, it just spreads, you know, it works. I mean, it's not completely scientific, but there is a certain amount of empiricism and objectivity involved, even in like pre-modern medicine or alchemy, maybe less so in astrology. But still. So modern psychology, yeah, I think throughout most of the history of psychology, it has been more pseudoscience than actual science. Like throughout most of the 20th century, you'd have some famous psychiatrist or psychologist, you know, Freud, Jung, Adler, there's lots of them, who would write their theories, and it was almost more a matter of just eloquence, you know, just being convincing, persuasive that they knew what they were talking about, that would cause them to get followers. And then you'd have these schools of psychology or psychoanalysis, or to less degree psychiatry, that, you know, like Freud. I mean, he's like the towering giant of Western psychology or psychoanalysis. You know, he might not be all that great now. He's sort of like Galileo of psychology in a way. But it's like the Oedipus complex and all this. It just seems just more like just weird ideas that Freud believed in, and so he just conveys these weird theories with a voice of authority, and he's largely right with regard to lots of other stuff. So people just accept it all and consider him to be some kind of oracle. Then, like in like the late 70s, there started being like really like psychologists that were trying to turn psychology into a hard science. It was called cognitive science. You know, they didn't even want to be besmirched by the word psychology in the name of their field of science, where it was like real, you know, understanding, you know, like how the nervous system interacts with various forms of behavior, what parts of the brain are responsible, you know, what evolutionary processes could have resulted in this aspect of human nature and so forth. And it was starting to really gain momentum, like in the 1980s, and then it became politically incorrect. You know, it's like human biodiversity. You know, it's like you just cannot accept that men and women are not the same psychologically. You cannot accept that various ethnicities are not just identical. And so it just pretty much got persecuted or just ignored into obscurity. So that's unfortunate. I assume there still is cognitive science going on. It's just that they have to be more careful because academia, where most of the psychological stuff is being worked out, seems to me, is pretty much just under the hobnail jackboot of the ideological left at this point. Psychiatry is more medical. I think you have to be an MD. You have to go to medical school to be a psychiatrist, which would involve more of the like pharmaceuticals, like the pharmaceutical aspect, what kind of medications to give somebody for this mental syndrome, that kind of thing, or in more extreme cases like brain surgery, that kind of thing. But I mean, also there's just the hackneyed truism that all psychologists are nuts, with few exceptions. But it seems to me that most psychologists and psychiatrists are pretty nutty. It's like they are studying psychology largely as a way of getting a grip with their own mental dysfunctions, and then they become kind of an authority on the subject, and then start applying what they've learned towards other people and making money from it. But yeah, most modern psychology and like psychoanalysis, it's still kind of a pseudoscience, which means it's not entirely wrong, just like pre-modern medicine wasn't entirely wrong. I mean, there's a lot of stuff they didn't understand, but still there were doctors way back in ancient times, and at least they did some things right, or alchemy. It wasn't really the science of chemistry yet, but still they knew how to do stuff, and they did have considerable knowledge and so forth. So yeah, I think modern psychology, just setting aside the fringe of like genuine cognitive science, is mostly like alchemy and pre-modern medicine. And then a lot of psychiatry nowadays is just prescribing pills. It's like you've got these symptoms, okay, take this pill, and it'll inhibit those symptoms. And that's about as far as that goes, which is empirical at least, but I don't think it's the best way of going about things. I used to know a psychiatrist who was one of the world's leading authorities on obsessive compulsive disorder, and he had to admit that sometimes pills, like I think, what was it called? I don't remember what the pill was. It was kind of an antidepressant that was popular back in the day. It can be used as like training wheels, but you don't want to just become dependent on taking meds your entire life. And so he was actually using Buddhist meditation techniques like satipatthana as a way of curing people of obsessive compulsive disorder. Somebody's has this obsessive compulsion, I guess it'd be more of a compulsion, to just wash their hands over and over again, until their hands are just bleeding because the soap and everything is just messing up their skin. And he would teach them satipatthana. It's just, you note the arising of the urge, and you just do not identify with it. It's not me, it's the OCD. And then you kind of distract yourself by doing something else. So long as you have this intense urge to wash your hands, you observe it, you note it, you remind yourself that it's not you, it is a mental dysfunction that you're trying to cure yourself of, and then knit or shoot baskets or something until the urge goes away. So, I mean, it's not entirely foolish or bad or wrong. It's just that it's not purely scientific at this point, especially psychology as opposed to psychiatry. I really don't know about psychoanalysis because I've never really delved very deeply into modern psychoanalysis. I know something about Freud, but Freud was pretty nutty of a human being, in my opinion. So, let's see. Did I answer the question? I guess I did well enough. I'm just going to move on to Siddhartha Lohachita's next question. Let's see. He says, do you believe there is a Rita as the Vedas? He says the Vedas. I think weren't the Vedas like a an Australoid tribe living in Sri Lanka and southern India. No, I think he means Vedas here. I'm just going to remove that D. I don't think he's talking about the Australoid tribe here. Okay. So Siddhartha Lohachita says, do you believe, was it the Vedas? I think maybe it was the Vedas. I don't know. I could just be confused. Anyways, Siddhartha Lohachita says, do you believe, are we recording? Yeah, looks like we're recording. Siddhartha Lohachita says, do you believe that there is a Rita, R-I-T-A, as the Vedas say, or as they said in medieval Christianity, a hierarchical order inspired by God, clearly adapted to a Buddhist vision of no almighty God? Could be a good and bad karma in some degree hierarchical, something like people with bad karma are less suited to knowledge or governance, or servants. People with good karma are more suited to governance and spirituality. That's how Tibet worked. Okay, there is actually a word, and I didn't look it up in Pali. It's kind of an obscure word. It doesn't get mentioned very much, but it's sort of like Varuna in the Rig Veda was, he was responsible. He was like the god of like cosmic order. And there is a kind of cosmic order in Buddhism, not so much scriptural Buddhism, but sort of commentarial sort of Buddhism. And I don't remember what the word is, but it's just like this cosmic order. And Abhidhamma is all about cosmic order. Abhidhamma philosophy, there's 17 mind moments to every moment of matter. And, it starts this way. You got the wiggling bhavanga, and then it goes through all these different stages. And, it's 28 kinds of matter and 52 different mental states and all this. It's just locked in. That's just the way it is. They don't ever try to explain why there's, this many mental states or this many mind moments for every moment of matter. They don't say why that is. They just know that mind operates faster than matter does and leave it at that. And so it's kind of like science. It's an attempt at being empirical. Even science doesn't explain, why it is that, gravity is the way it is, or like the charge of the electron is exactly such and such. They don't usually go so far as to say why, it's like this, but it's just, this is the way it is. We've observed it. This is the way it is. So there's a lot of that in Buddhism. With regard to ethics, ethics is just based on human psychology. Anything that takes you closer to enlightenment is good, and anything that takes you farther away from it is bad. And enlightenment isn't just some arbitrary state. It's anything that increases attraction, aversion, and semi-conscious stupidity is unskillful. Anything that decreases attraction, aversion, and unenlightened or semi-conscious stupidity is good. Anything that increases desire is bad. Anything that decreases desire is good, because it's getting you closer to ultimate reality, which is not just some abstract pick. It's just somebody decided, it's enlightenment is point A here. It doesn't work that way. So, it's Buddhist ethics, and this Buddhist order is largely just empirical, just observing the way things are and just trying to explain it and explain this is the way things are. It's not God, it's not some cosmic force even necessarily that's making it that way. It's just that's the way it is. This example he gives at the end, though, is I could kind of pick at that a little bit. He says, people with bad karma are less suited to knowledge or governance. Well, the saintly people are not the best people to be governing a state. You want ruthless badasses who are patriotic and really are trying to help their country that are running the state. That's another thing of like the feminized postmodern world, especially kind of the political left. They think that the leaders should be these paragons of virtue. Whereas a paragon of virtue, he's just going to be nice. He'll be nice he'll forgive his enemies. He'll just, like violent criminals will just be forgiven and just turn loose back onto the streets. This is happening all the time in America now, where you've got violent criminals who they've already been convicted of felonies like up in double digits, mainly for violent crimes or other things like drug dealing and so forth. And they just get this little slap on the wrist, or even the slap on the wrist might be seen as offensive. And they just think, oh, poor baby, just go and sin no more. And then they stab some Ukrainian woman in the neck on a public transport. I mean, that guy, he had been arrested so many times for violent crimes, they just keep letting him go. And that's like what the gentle, forgiving, saintly, or at least, sort of feminine governors, like leaders, are more inclined to do. It's weird. So, I mean, you want some ruthless, tough badass who nevertheless has honor and principles and is a patriotic servant of his country. Probably the Roman Emperor Honorius was a nicer person than, say, Trajan, but Trajan kicked ass. Man, he led Rome to glory. It's the peak of their prosperity was under Trajan. At least the maximum extent of the empire was under Trajan. Honorius, he was married twice, probably died a virgin. While Rome was being sacked by the Goths, he's like feeding ornamental chickens. This kind of stuff. He's maybe a really nice guy, but just totally worthless as a leader. So let's see. This actually try to answer the question now. Now that all that is like introductory verbiage, see, do you believe that there is a Rita or cosmic order, as the Vedas say, or as they say in medieval Christianity, a hierarchical order inspired by God? Clearly adapted to a Buddhist vision of no almighty God. Well, obviously there is a kind of cosmic order. Like in science, laws of physics are an attempt to describe cosmic order. So Buddhism, it observes this kind of stuff and teaches it to some degree, but it's not some sort of divine consciousness or divine force that's holding everything together. In a way, it's sort of like in science, you have the Big Bang, it's just pure blinding energy. And then finally stuff starts to coalesce in a way that is stable. If it's not stable, it just disappears. So it's just the energy of the Big Bang or whatever it is just coalesces into some kind of stable pattern that can perpetuate. And that's pretty much what the universe has done from the Buddhist point of view also, it seems to me. I mean, if you think that the universe is just generated by ignorance and delusion, then still there has to be a certain stability. There has to be something stable for anything to exist for more than a trillionth of a second. There has to be continuity. And for whatever reason, the universe, our version of it, our samsara, has sort of like the right balance, the middle path between like stability and change. Just complete change would just be chaos, nothing staying the same for more than a trillionth of a second. Complete stability would just be like frozen death. So you have to have like this middle path. It's like dependent co-arising. Stability and change have to be in this balance, and they mutually condition each other. Some stuff has to stay the same, at least enough that you recognize it as the same thing persisting over time. Well, at the same time, there has to be change every moment. But in Buddhism, I think it's more empirical. It's not formulating any kind of divine force holding things together. It's just, this is the way it is, deal with it. And it's based on observation, like empirical observation, a lot of it. Not everything in Buddhism is necessarily empirical, like, pre-existing Buddhas going back zillions of years. That's mythology, that's legend. So there's a lot of that too. But then you've got, like, in the Buddha Wamsa, you've got this template. Each Buddha has to follow the same pattern where he has to renounce the world in one of like a limited number of vehicles, on a horse, in a chariot, on an elephant, or in a flying palace, like a vimana, a flying mansion. He's got to he's got to practice austerities with other ascetics for a certain period of time. He's got to accept milk rice from some virtuous female and then sit under a tree of enlightenment. Every Buddha, going back zillions of years, has become enlightened sitting under a tree. And Buddhist mythologizers, they want to try and kind of fit that into a stable pattern also. Although when you get to that point, all you're doing is just kind of retconning previous mythological Buddhas in accordance with the pattern of our Gautama Buddha. So it's even the finding order in patterns, stable patterns and all that, is some of it is just human nature just making shit up. Okay, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Practice Metta. And we're getting down towards the bottom here. Well, getting close to the bottom here. Practice Metta says, do you believe journaling to be useful in any way, for example, to help settle the mind? It seems to be either discouraged or outright banned during meditation retreats. Yeah, it tends to be discouraged or banned during meditation retreats, just like talking on the phone tends to be discouraged or outright banned during meditation retreats. It's not meditative, really. First of all, you got to be thinking in order to be writing. And at a meditation retreat, you should be keeping even thinking down to a minimum. If it's a beginning meditation retreat, you may still have to think quite a lot. Even your meditation technique may involve lots of thinking, at least labeling. But yeah, journaling, I did a little bit of journaling. Just keeping like a diary. I experimented with that as a monk. But mainly in my case, I was just using it as a kind of time capsule. I think that's probably, from the Buddhist point of view, or the point of view of a Buddhist renunciate, that may be the best reason for using a journal, is a kind of time capsule, in that you're putting down on paper like a portrait of your own mental life, so that 5 years from now you can read that and see if you've made progress. Are you, to what extent have I changed? To what extent am I better? To what extent maybe am I worse than then? That was the main reason why I was writing stuff down, is just as a kind of time capsule, so I could look back and see this is where I was then, and how do I compare that with now? Have I made progress? And if so, what? That kind of thing. But I'm not sure exactly what other benefit there would be in journaling from a monastic point of view. From a lay point of view, journaling can just help to hone your writing skills, that kind of thing. And some monks may need good writing skills. I did a lot of writing as a monk. Thomas Merton was a Christian monk who was just like addicted to just writing pretty much all day long. He wrote a lot. He was just kind of compulsive writer, I think. But it's like being a good teacher is not really of primary importance to being a monk, or at least it shouldn't be. Some people are ordained as monks just because they want to be famous Dhamma teachers. But seriously, journaling, writing in a diary, it's lots of thinking. And as a general rule, it's lots of self-view, ego. So, I experimented with it for a while, a couple years. I've got maybe a couple years worth of journals, maybe a little less than 2 years worth of journals. I had one, the long one, like my main experiment with journaling. I had that published on my old website. I don't think it's on my new website, and that should be rectified. There's some people say that of all the things that I've written, that was really their favorite thing that I'd ever written, was this journal that I kept while living under a rock ledge in Alondo Kathapan National Park, just talking about my challenges and struggles, the occasional success of being an ascetic monk, just living out in the forest with no roof over my head for almost a year. But I have to admit, at certain times of year, my journal consisted largely of just bitching and moaning over just not being able to stop sweating or be comfortable for any length of time. It was awful. So, yeah, the main purpose of journaling from a monk, a monastic point of view, is just kind of to take a snapshot of where you are at, like spiritually at that time, so that you can refer to it later and kind of see if you're making progress, see if you've improved or gotten worse or that kind of thing. But with regard to a layperson journaling, you can use it for that reason still, but there may be other reasons, just like being able to organize your thoughts better, becoming a better writer, being able to express yourself more skillfully, that sort of thing. It can be useful for that also. Or it can also be used as incriminating evidence against you if you ever commit a crime. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cyrus Frame, one of the few people to ask questions on Rumble. And he says, this is kind of an interesting one. It's kind of a long question, though. It's one of those questions that's kind of like a little essay with thoughts at the end. But it's still kind of interesting here. Cyrus Frame says, it seems to me that the koan I asked about last week, that was the last question of the previous Q&A, but I interrupt myself and I'll start again. Cyrus Frame says, it seems to me that the koan I asked you about last week, the man up a tree, is pertinent for what you do in this channel. Bodhidharma came from the West to teach the Dharma. The man in the tree is part of that tradition of teaching the Dharma, as are you. However, some of the questions people ask you, particularly concerning what there is after Nibbutta, or the thoughts of enlightened people, I think you sometimes get frustrated with answering because, as you say, that is off the scale. Any description, therefore, is not really going to cut it. If you stay silent or not answer the question in a way that is a truer representation, or at least it is not being forced to speak in metaphors. On the other hand, by staying silent, you are perhaps failing to communicate the Dharma. It would also be a strange video if you just sat there in silence. Clinging to the tree by his teeth represents silence as he cannot speak. Letting go to speak means falling into a kind of misrepresentation. So I think the koan is about the paradox or dilemma of how do you express or communicate the inexpressible. For what it's worth, this is how I would answer the question right now. I would say I don't know what I would do, as it is a hypothetical situation, and so anything I say would be a view. Also, it is similar to the song Que Sera Sera by Doris Day. What will be, the future is not ours to see, only instead of the situation being in the future, it is a hypothetical reality. So how could I know what I would do in that? There is only what you do in the real reality, and even that is always unknown before it happens. What do you think? Well, that is a good insight, that comparing the koan to, a teacher or a monk trying to put into words what you really cannot put into words, trying to teach reality when reality cannot be expressed symbolically in language. So yeah, that's a good insight. I can appreciate that. I mean, still, it's the koan is this riddle that has no correct answer, and so And just practically by definition, a koan is a riddle that has no correct answer, and you are required to answer it correctly. And one person's correct answer may be very different than another person's correct answer. I mean, they may be opposites because it's not the words coming out so much as the mental states. Like I said before, I think in the previous Q&A, the correct answer may be just, the Roshi asks you the unanswerable riddle, and you just say, "Good morning, Roshi." And that may be good enough, depending on your mental states, which the Roshi will have to feel into, I guess, intuitively. So, yeah, but with regard to asking a question, what would you do under such and such circumstances? It's a common, in a way, it's almost like a trick. Like I remember a long time ago, back in the 80s, back when George Dukakis was running for president, and he was a Democrat. I actually voted for him. I voted Democrat in those days. I can't remember who he was running against. Maybe George Bush the first. Yeah, I don't remember now. But anyways, he was seen as kind of cold and unfeeling. He's kind of out of touch. Not really a heart-oriented person. And so some reporter who's trying to ask a gotcha sort of question, which they've been doing for a long time. It hasn't been invented just for Donald Trump. He asks him, what would happen if your wife got abused or assaulted or something? And he just kind of was like a deer in the headlights. He really didn't know how to answer the question, if I remember correctly. And that was seen as, look, he really is just cold and unfeeling. But I mean, being fair to him, I mean, you can't really know in advance what you're going to do. I've recently, I had an interview where someone was asking me, what would you do under such and such circumstances? And honestly, I mean, sometimes you just have to say, well, I mean, it's going to depend on all sorts of things. You have to act spontaneously in the flow. And so what you do is going to depend on, who you're interacting with and where and how and why and all this. And of course, that's not the kind of answer that people want. They want like a yes or no kind of answer. So, yeah, I mean, you can't really answer a question like that accurately with certainty in a lot of cases. I mean, if you're in a crisis situation, how would you act in a crisis situation? You can't really know until you're in a crisis situation. You're not just going to be using your ordinary thinking mind to decide what to do in a crisis situation. Somebody assaults your woman while you are there, then what exactly are you going to do? I mean, in all likelihood, you just kind of charge the guy and punch him in the face or whatever. But I mean, you can't know for sure exactly how you're going to respond. You could just grab a lamp and bash him with that or something. I mean, who knows? But let's not talk about bashing people with lamps. Let's see. Yeah, I think that Cyrus Frame may be correct in his interpretation of the koan as a kind of metaphor for like a Zen teacher, especially, who's trying to convey what cannot be expressed. You either have to remain silent or you just sort of babble and hope that the babbling is skillful enough means that it helps the other person, even though you'd probably be more correct just to remain silent. And some Zen masters actually did remain silent. There's one Zen master, I think he's mentioned in Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, who he carried a flute around with him. And if he was asked a question about Buddhism, he would just take the flute out and blow one note on it and put the flute back in. Or there was another Zen master who, when asked a question about Zen, he would just lift one finger. It's like Gute, I think it was his name, Gute, I think, I vaguely remember the story about, there was this Zen master, this teacher, this Roshi, who when asked questions about Buddhism would raise one finger. And then there was one of the novices, one of the kid monks, started doing the same thing. One of his teachers would ask him a question, he would just raise one finger. And so Gute hears about this, and he calls this young novice to him and asks him a question about Buddhism. The little kid raises one finger. Gute just grabs the kid and just chops his finger off. And then he says, now, how do you answer? And then supposedly, according to the legend, according to the story, the kid became enlightened. So I guess that justifies cutting his finger off. So yeah, I mean, it's still the unanswerable question. What do you do? I mean, you have the duty to answer the question, which causes you to fall out of the tree and die. But still, I mean, you do the best you can. And I think I'm just gonna move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, could you explain in brief the Jain religion, mainly about the afterlife options? Well, I mean, the afterlife options of Jainism are pretty similar to Buddhism and like Hinduism. I mean, they believed in rebirth or reincarnation. And, there's all these different realms. So in that case, it wasn't that different from Buddhism or Hinduism. It's just that the Jain religion apparently was based more on like a spiritual system going back to the Indus Valley civilization that was kind of pessimistic. It's like the world is a bad place that you should try to free yourself from. And, they believed in karma, which to the Jains was almost like a physical substance that you could, unlike in Buddhism, where karma was purely psychological, in Jainism, there was also a physical component where even if you stepped on a bug accidentally, you were still making bad karma. So that's why the Jain monks, a lot of them will have like these soft grass brooms where they sweep the path in front of them so that they won't step on any ants even accidentally. And they'll wear like the face mask thing just so they won't breathe in any flying insects accidentally, because even if you do it accidentally, from the Jainist point of view, it's still bad karma. So a lot of the assumptions of Jainism are similar to the assumptions of Buddhism and Hinduism or proto-Hinduism. But they did consider there is a soul or a jiva. I've mentioned this, I think it was in the previous Q&A. You've got this soul called the jiva that has karma sticking to it and weighing it down. So what the Jains were supposed to do is just burn off their karma. It's very simple philosophy. You've got this karma and you have to just get rid of it without making new karma. So they were like lawful neutral, going with Dungeons and Dragons. They weren't going to make any karma. They wouldn't accept alms from a place where there's a hungry dog or lots of buzzing flies, because they might deprive the dog or the flies of a meal if somebody gives them food instead of just throwing it out in the street. So the Jains, they had more of a mechanistic view of things, maybe a little more archaic understanding of things than the Buddhists and some of the like the Upanishadic teachers, like Vedanta. But I mean, with regard to the realms of samsara and everything, it was fairly similar. It's just that you have a jiva, you have this soul, and your karma sticks to it and weighs it down. And so you have to burn off the karma through self-torture even sometimes. You just get rid of the karma. Don't make any new karma until finally you're free of all karma, and then your jiva just wafts up into some eternal heaven. I mean, it's fairly simple, very straightforward. More so than Buddhism or Vedanta. And that's pretty much it. I mean, the lengths that they would go to avoid making new karma. And I mean, they would torture themselves, which was, I mean, it was sort of like a passive kind of torture, like I mentioned before, that just remaining in a squatting position was a common torture technique that the Jains would inflict upon themselves. And if you don't think that just squatting in one place can be torture. Just squat in one place for an hour straight. Just try to watch an entire movie while squatting on the floor in front of the TV set. And you're going to find that it hurts. It is painful. And then apparently the Jains, when they figured that they had burned off all their karma, I mean, they would self-delete before, they might accidentally mess up and start making more karma and then die in a state where they've got karma that's going to be weighing down their jiva. They figure once they're free of karma, that they self-delete. And the way they would do it is they just walk off into like some desolate area and then just squat down and just remain in a squatting position, not drinking or eating until they were dead. I assume it'd be like kidney failure from dehydration that would get them first. But it's kind of a strange religion. And they did believe that fire was like a living being. They weren't allowed to drink cold water, but they weren't allowed to build a fire to cook their water. And so they mainly survived on drinking the water that was drained from boiling rice. They'd walk around in the morning and a lot of them would be naked. They wouldn't own anything. And so they just beg. They wouldn't have a begging bowl. They just cup their hands like this. And apparently the nice ladies would save their rice water and pour it into their hands or something, let them drink from the pot or something. And I would assume they got a lot of their calories just from this water that had boiled rice in it, because some of them were ascetic to the point they would eat. I mean, if you can believe the Buddhist texts, then some of the extreme ones would eat once every 2 weeks, which, yeah, that's kind of hard to believe. But even eating just once every 3 days, I mean, one meal a day, one meal every 3 days, plus drained off rice water. They're pretty skinny. I would guess that a lot of those Jain monks were in advanced state of emaciation. And I used to wonder how these malnourished Jain monks would survive the wintertime, because a lot of them were naked. They were sky-clad. Digambara Jains would just be naked. They would own nothing. No clothes, no begging bowl, nothing. So it turns out that in the wintertime, and it gets down to about freezing in the Ganges Valley, at least it did in the Buddhist time, during the wintertime, that they would just smear themselves with mud, and then that would be their insulation. That would keep them from dying of hypothermia. Of course, the mud would probably be crawling with little microscopic creatures and worms and so forth, but I guess you have to kind of have to be flexible with regard to certain things. But yeah, the Jain religion was apparently like a relic of pre-Vedic religion that may have had its origins in the Indus Valley civilization, the Shramana tradition, which also produced the Ajivakas, which are now extinct. It's a spiritual movement that was common in the Buddhist time. There were more Ajivakas than Buddhists, in the early times of Buddhism. And it also it gave rise to Sankhya, which was another one of these atheistic, kind of pessimistic, believing in a kind of a mechanistic idea of karma, and you need to purify yourself to escape from this world, of this samsaric world, this kind of thing. And Sankhya eventually, at least one branch of it, got incorporated into Hinduism as yoga. And Buddhism also has roots there, although the Buddha himself was arguably a philosophical genius in addition to being fully enlightened. And he kind of adjusted certain things, like karma is a mental state, not just this mechanistic phenomenon of the universe, that kind of thing. And he apparently he refined an idea of dependent co-arising, which was so refined that almost nobody, including most Buddhists, can understand it. But I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. And he's our last questioner of the evening. By golly, he asked 3 questions, though. So Ethiopian Fake Tig's first question is, what are some signs that someone is progressing in their practice after they become ordained as a monk? Or is that signs for outward observers, or is that signs for the monk himself? It's, Ethiopian fake tig does not specify. But if one is progressing in their practice, they're going to be like serene. They may have like this glow of serenity and contentment. They're enthusiastic about their practice. They're enthusiastic about being a monk. They look forward to meditating. This kind of thing they are signs that one is progressing. But I mean, that's not the only kind of signs that one is progressing. I mean, it may be that there's a lot of friction and like aversion and stuff arising, which is just stuff that has to burn itself out. It's just, you've got all these habits that you established as a layperson that they're not fitting the monk's life very well. And so there's going to be some bumpy roads, some choppy seas, so to speak, that, I mean, you can still be progressing even though it's not really obvious, because the monk may be going through like internal upheavals, just, trying to reprogram himself from being a worldly minded layperson into being some spiritual renunciant. But if they are progressing, they should be, more content, more serene, less talkative, just less excitable, less like emotionally worked up over things. Or if they are emotionally worked up over everything, it should be like faith and gratitude and enthusiasm for practice, that kind of thing. But I mean, it's hard to say for an outside observer, and sometimes it's hard to say even for oneself to what extent one is progressing, because sometimes it may seem like your mind is just rebelling against Dhamma, but I mean, that may be a kind of, you're just having to work your way through this wilderness. It's like the dark night of the soul that St. John of the Cross was talking about. I mean, according to St. John of the Cross, this dark night of the soul, this bleak dryness with no consolation, is just a prerequisite for the next stage, which is a very exalted spiritual state. So there's not always obvious signs that one's progressing. Maybe one may be having, meltdowns and crises that are just kind of burning defilements, and so that you can progress to the next stage. Or the crisis might be the sort of crisis that just slams you into the next stage. And in some cases, it may be just necessary for you to go through that. And so you may seem like a basket case to yourself and others, while not realizing just how close you are to reaching like the next stage, which may be the relatively exalted stage in your progress, your spiritual progress. So just because someone isn't showing they're not just like glowing with spiritual light, just serene and equanimous and all that. I mean, if they're not showing those signs, it doesn't mean they're not making progress. They're just making a different kind of progress. But I mean, if they're happier after they become a monk, that's a good sign that they're making progress. If they just, they were happy before they became a monk, and then they're miserable while they're a monk, they're still going to be making some kind of progress, I suppose. But I mean, it's not a very good sign, it seems to me. And I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian fake tig's next question, and take the last drink of cold coffee. Like that. Open the emergency backup beverage like this. Take a drink of that so that they can mix in my digestive system. And then I'm going to answer Ethiopian fake tig's second question, which is as follows. After his enlightenment, how come the Buddha didn't go back for his son to perhaps guide him and help him as a father? Well, actually, he did. His son was named Rahula, according to tradition. And it was a few years. If Rahula was a baby when the Buddha renounced the world, then I think he was like 7 or something like that when the Buddha finally did go back to his hometown of Kapilavatthu after he'd kind of established Buddhism, set up the Sangha and everything. And he felt the time was ripe to go back to Kapilavatthu. And he went back there and, met his father and met his, I guess, still his wife. Although, of course, they were separated. And I think it was his wife that demanded that little Rahula should have his inheritance because he's like a royal prince or something. But the Buddha, who was inclined to reinterpret traditionally understood terms, said, yeah, I'll give him his inheritance. He'll get his what's the word? His legacy. And then the Buddha ordained him. So he ordained Rahula, and then Rahula eventually became enlightened. So it's hard to say that the Buddha did anything wrong by abandoning his child and then staying gone for years, because the way he did it, still his son wound up becoming a fully enlightened arahant anyway. So, anything that results in somebody becoming a fully ordained arahant can't be all bad, seems to me. So he did guide him and help him as a father, and there are at least 2 Rahula suttas in the texts, one of which is in the Sutta Nipata, which is a very nice sutta, by the way. So, I answered that one. And so I'm moving on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's last question, which is the last question of this Q&A. And he says, can you tell me the story you told on how you think the Buddha would look like if someone was to time travel back in time to be in his Sangha? Perhaps add some more details, since I like the picture you painted last time. Well, I did mention in a previous Q&A that when I was a monk, I had sort of cooked up this little science fiction story about these people who are going to go back in time in a time machine and visit the Buddha. And you've got the smug scholar, he's like a president of the Polytech Society, written all kinds of learned books on the subject. You've got the Burmese Sayadaw, the fundamentalist, religious Buddhist. Then you've got sort of like the Western liberal kind of Buddhist, this woman who got famous for writing books like, liberating the Buddha from within, these kind of new agey self-help books with a Buddhist theme, that kind of thing. And then you have to have like the technician who's just running the machine. And of course, the woman who wrote, liberating the freeing the Buddha within you, this kind of thing. She just has like this sudden crisis that prevents her from going back, and the implication in the story would be it's just some sort of like subconscious fear is just causing her to just have psychosomatic symptoms or whatever, panic attacks or something, that just she's not going to face the Buddha because she knows she's not, or at least she considers herself deep down to be unworthy or some such. Then they go back in the time machine. The smug scholar, the Sayadaw, and the technician, they go back to the Ganges Valley and they ask around. And one of the first humiliations for the Sayadaw is nobody can understand his Pali. So the scholar, who's like an authority on Indic languages, Prakrits, this kind of stuff, he's able to communicate well enough that they get instructions on where the Buddha is. So they go to where the Buddha is supposed to be, and there's just like this skinny guy wearing rags, probably doesn't smell very good, who's got maybe like a fly crawling on the side of his head. He's scruffy looking, doesn't have the lump on top of his head. He's got, like a week's growth of stubble all over his face and head. Just sitting there serenely with, other people who look kind of similar. They're all dressed in dirty rags. well, at least maybe a few of them had washed their rags recently, but they're skinny, they're not very clean, scruffy looking. They're not the exalted, noble beings that you see in the Buddhist art. They're just, they look, they don't look very impressive, at least from a superficial point of view. Even though, you gaze upon them with a little bit of sensitivity, you'd see that they're just like glowing with serenity, this kind of thing. Very peaceful, very calm, just sitting like statues if they're sitting in meditation. But yeah, the Buddha himself, assuming that the legends have some truth to them, he'd probably be taller than the average person, probably skinny, probably scruffy looking, wearing rags. It was against the rules for a monk to bathe more than twice a month. So, unless it was a certain time of year, like the end of the hot season or the beginning of the rainy season, there's a good chance that, he may have gone a week or more without bathing, just wearing kind of brownish colored, robes that were sewn together pretty sloppily because they didn't have, good thread or anything in those days. And, maybe more than one fly crawling on it. But, he'd probably have a noble bearing. He'd be Caucasian, probably. Whether, if not Indo-Aryan, then at least Indo-Iranian. Because, there's a possibility that, his ancestors, and like the Sakya tribe, Sakya and Scythian and Saka all sound similar. So there's a possibility that he was more closely related genetically, at least with regard to the male line of his ancestry, to some Indo-Iranian, more or less Scythian tribe that, settled in India along with the Indo-Aryans. But, they look pretty much the same. He'd be like relatively Caucasian features, kind of a longish, straightish nose, high forehead, not very dark skin, possibly blue eyes. At least tradition says he had Abhinila Neta, which is like intensely blue eyes. Probably black hair, which would be like stubble. So, that's pretty much what he would look like, I guess. That would be like an educated guess as to what the Buddha looked like. If he stood up, he'd be taller than most people, at least taller than most people in those days. Might not be taller than the average modern Dutch person, but still tall, skinny, more or less like Indo-European or like Iranian looking. Not very clean, probably. No lump on top of the head. Probably no spiral here. Probably no webbed fingers and toes. Like the 32 marks of the great being. Probably wouldn't have very many of them. He looked like an ordinary ascetic in ancient India of like the upper classes. So he'd look more European than, the lower classes would look, who are mainly of like Aboriginal ancestry, Aboriginal Indians, Dravidian types. It doesn't really matter what he looked like, but I guess if you're going to revere somebody, it's good to kind of have some idea in your mind of roughly what he might look like. It helps to focus your devotion or gratitude or your concentration of some sort onto such a being. That's why they have statues and other images. But let's see, did I answer the question? Let's see. Can you tell me the story you told? Yeah, I might as well finish the story where the Burmese Seattle, when he sees this kind of scroungy, not extremely clean looking person who doesn't have all the marks and the lump on his head and everything. He just can't believe that's the Buddha. He just thinks this is ridiculous, and he just stomps off, refuses to even meet him. Then the smug scholar goes up, and he's just sort of asking questions that he pretty much already knows the answers to, as a way of just kind of showing off how knowledgeable he is, which the Buddha sees through immediately, And then the scholar just kind of smugly and politely, he's Oxbridge educated, so he's very polite. But still, he smugly excuses himself because he also wants to go meet Makali Gosala, and he's on a limited schedule. So he takes off, just smugly smiling. That was very satisfying. I got to meet the Buddha, so that's definitely going to help my career, that kind of thing. And then finally, when they're ready to go back into the future, the humble technician, who hasn't been talking much, just been taking orders, doing his job, they can't find him. So finally, they go back to the Buddha, and there's the technician who is just like on his knees or on his face, in front of the Buddha, just. He's refusing to leave. He's finally gotten to the presence of the Buddha. I mean, there's no indication of what his spiritual beliefs were previously, but it's just the implication of the story would be, and I'm not skillful enough at writing fiction to write this story, but that he was sensitive in a way that the other people weren't, and he could feel this spiritual profundity there. Sufficiently that he was like, this is it. This is the real deal. I'm staying. And that was the end of the story, the end. And that's it. That's the end of the Q&A also. And like I should always say at the beginning, and pretty much never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer, especially with regard to Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism, Buddhism in general, Indian philosophy in general, spirituality, Dharma in general, meditation, what it's like to be in Burma, that kind of stuff that you think I can answer, then feel free to ask. No more than 3 questions per person, please. My 4th book is still going to be coming out soon, inshallah. I still have to get some of the artwork finished. But that's really the only thing holding me up at this point. That's the bottleneck at present. And what else was I going to say? It's going to be something really important too. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. That wasn't the important thing I was going to say though, and now I'm probably not even going to remember it. Damn. Anyways, I guess I've said everything that really needs to be said, except for the final thing that I always say, which is be happy.